Emma Whitaker pressed her bruised wrist flat against the flour-dusted counter and did not cry. She had learned a long time ago that crying only made her father angrier. The papers on the table said she belonged to Silas Briggs by Friday. Her father's signature was already dry. She was 23 years old, and she had just been sold. Then the bakery door flew open, and the man who stepped through it was not from this town. He was not from any town she had ever known. If this story already has your heart, subscribe to this channel, hit that bell, and drop your city in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now, let's go back to where it all began. The summer of 1883 came down on Oak Hollow like a punishment. The heat pressed into every wooden building on the main street, baked the mud hard as brick, and turned the air above the road into something that shimmered and bent. By mid-July, the town smelled like dust and dried horse sweat and the sour tang of the tannery at the edge of the creek. The men who sat outside the general store stopped talking by noon and just stared at the ground. The women moved fast between errands, heads down, not looking at each other. Emma Whitaker had lived in Oak Hollow her entire life, and she had learned to move that same way. Head down, fast, don't draw attention. She was up before 4 every morning. The bakery had to run regardless of what had happened the night before, regardless of whether her hands were steady or shaking, regardless of the bruise along her left jaw that she'd been hiding under a high collar for 6 days now. The bread didn't care about any of that. The bread had a schedule, and if she didn't keep it, her father would make the rest of the day worse than the morning already was. Henry Whitaker had been a decent man once. People in town said so quietly, in that way people say things they no longer fully believe. He'd run a clean bakery for 20 years, married a good woman, raised a quiet daughter. And then his wife got sick, and the bills came, and Silas Briggs had an office on the corner of Main and 2nd, with a painted sign that read, "Lending and Settlement." And Henry Whitaker had walked through that door 3 years ago, like a man walking into water he thought was only knee-deep. It was not knee-deep. Emma knew the number by heart. $412. She'd found the loan papers in her father's desk drawer 8 months ago and read them twice, folded them back exactly as they were, and never said a word. She knew better than to say a word. She was sliding the first loaves into the oven when she heard him come down the stairs. Henry Whitaker moved through the kitchen the way he always moved, heavy, deliberate, like the floor owed him something. He was a large man, gone thick through the middle in the last few years, with a face that had once been open and had since closed like a door that no longer fit its frame. He stopped in the kitchen doorway, looked at the oven, looked at Emma. "You burned the rye yesterday," he said. "I didn't." She kept her back to him. "It was the back corner. The oven's running hot on the right side. I've told you about that." "Don't tell me about my own oven." She didn't answer. He moved to the small table near the window and sat down, and for a moment the only sound was the fire in the oven and the faint noise of the street beginning to wake outside. "Briggs is coming Friday," Henry said. Emma went still. Her hands were inside the oven adjusting a loaf pan, and she stayed exactly like that for 1 long second before she straightened up and closed the oven door. "What for?" she said, though she already knew. "To collect." "We don't have $400, Papa." "No." He picked up a tin mug, set it down without drinking from it. "We don't." She turned around slowly. "Then what does he collect?" Henry didn't look at her. That was her answer. Emma stood in her own kitchen with flour on her hands and felt something go cold in the center of her chest. Not surprise. She hadn't been surprised by much in a long time. But cold, the specific coldness of a thing you've been afraid to name, finally being named out loud, even if no one said the actual word yet. "Papa?" Her voice was steady. She made it steady. "Look at me." He picked up the mug again. "Look at me and say it." "You'll go to work for him," Henry said to the mug. "At the saloon. He's got a boarding house attached. Respectable enough." "That is not respectable, and you know it." "You'll have a roof." "That is not—" She stopped, breathed. "Papa, I work here. I run this bakery. I am the reason there is any money coming in at all, and you know that. Whatever I earn at that saloon goes straight to Briggs. You understand that, don't you? He doesn't clear the debt. He just owns both of us then." Henry slammed the mug on the table. "You think I don't know that?" His voice cracked at the edges. "You think I had some other choice? You think I've been sitting here for 3 years not knowing what that man is? I know what he is. I've always known." He pressed his hands flat on the table. "But the debt is real, Emma. It don't disappear because we don't like the man it's owed to. There are other ways to—" "There are no other ways." He said it quietly, and that quietness was worse than the shouting. "I've looked, I've asked. Judge Calloway won't touch it. Briggs has him in his pocket deep enough to drown in. The bank in Clearfield won't lend to a man with my debt sheet. I wrote to your uncle in Missouri 6 months ago and never heard back." He looked up at her then, finally. His eyes were red at the rims. "Friday, Emma. That's the day. I need you to be ready." She walked out of the kitchen. She went to the front of the bakery and stood behind the counter and looked out the glass window at the empty morning street and thought with extraordinary calm that she was going to have to solve this herself. Because her father couldn't. Because there was no one else. Because there had never been anyone else. The first customer came in at 6:30. Old Mrs. Hale, who bought a half loaf of white bread 3 times a week and always paid exact change from a small leather purse. She asked Emma how her father was doing. Emma said fine. Mrs. Hale looked at her the way women in this town looked at Emma sometimes, with a kind of knowing sadness that never translated into anything useful, and left. By 8, the bakery was doing its usual morning run. Wives mostly. A couple of ranch hands. The schoolteacher, Mr. Pryor, who bought 2 rolls every day, and always said the same thing, finest rolls in the territory. Emma smiled and said thank you, and wrapped his rolls and kept moving. She was thinking about Friday. She was thinking about $412. She was thinking about whether there was any arrangement of events in which she did not end up working in Silas Briggs's saloon by the end of next week. She hadn't found one yet. He came in at 9:30. She didn't know him. That was the first thing she registered in Oak Hollow. You knew everyone, or you knew of them, and Emma made it her particular business to notice people carefully. This man was not from here. That was obvious the way certain things are obvious, not from any single detail, but from all of them at once. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, weathered in the specific way of men who spent more time outside than in. His hat was dark and trail-worn. His coat the kind of heavy canvas that made sense in high-elevation country, where the temperature could drop 30 degrees between noon and nightfall. He moved differently than the men of Oak Hollow moved, slower, more deliberate, like a man who had learned never to waste motion, because wasted motion in the mountains could kill you. He stopped just inside the door. He looked at the room, the way she'd noticed certain men looked at rooms, doorways, first windows, second people, third. It took him less than 2 seconds, and then his eyes landed on her. She said, "Help you." He walked to the counter. Up close, she could see he was older than she'd first thought. Mid-30s maybe, with a jaw that hadn't seen a razor in a week, and eyes that were a particular shade of gray-green that made her think of creek water in early morning. "Bread, bae," he said. "Whatever keeps longest." "That'd be the sourdough." She turned and pulled a round loaf from the shelf behind her. 75 cents. You traveling? Back up to the high country. He looked at the loaf. I'll take 2. She wrapped them in paper. He set coins on the counter without counting them. She could see without looking closely that it was more than the price. Men who were very comfortable with money sometimes did that, or men who didn't want to waste time on arithmetic. "You're from the Ridge settlements?" she asked. He glanced at her. "Trapping country, east of the Gilpin Range." She slid the wrapped loaves across the counter. "Long ride down." "Needed supplies." He picked up the bread. Didn't move to leave. His eyes moved just briefly to the left side of her face, and she felt it, the specific awareness of someone noticing something she'd been trying not to be noticed. She lifted her chin slightly, kept her expression neutral. He didn't say anything about it. He just looked at her the way a man looks when he's filing something away, quiet and unhurried. "Good bread," he said, which was a strange thing to say given he hadn't tried it yet. "Thank you." He put on his hat and left. Emma watched him walk back out into the summer heat of Main Street and thought, "I don't know that man," which was true. And then she thought something else, something she couldn't entirely explain. He noticed. He came back that afternoon. She was alone by then. Her father had gone to the mill to argue about the flour price, which he did every week, and never won. And the afternoon was slow, the bakery empty, the heat outside so heavy it seemed to lean against the windows. The mountain man walked back in like he hadn't been there 6 hours earlier. He stood at the counter. "I have bread," he said, which was clearly not what he'd come for. Emma set down the book she'd been reading and looked at him. "Is there something else?" He leaned one arm on the counter. Not casual, careful, like a man making a deliberate decision about how much space to take up. "Silas Briggs," he said. "What does he want with this bakery?" She stared at him. "I don't know what business of yours. Heard your father talking to the dry goods man this morning," he said. "I wasn't trying to hear it, but I was close and he wasn't quiet." Emma said nothing. "Briggs runs a particular kind of operation," the man said. His voice was level, like he was recounting weather conditions. "Takes debt and turns it into labor. Gets men to sign over daughters. Gets widows to sign over land. He's been doing it in 2 other counties before this one. Tends to work out well for Briggs." "I know what Silas Briggs does," Emma said. "Then you know that Friday's not a deadline. It's a closing." Her hands were still on the countertop. She didn't move them. "What's your name?" she said. "Hawthorne. Jack Hawthorne." "Mr. Hawthorne." She made herself look directly at him. "I appreciate that you apparently have some awareness of my situation. But I don't know you, and I am not in the habit of discussing my family's business with strangers." "Fair," he said. "What are you in the habit of doing about it?" "Solving it myself." He nodded once, like that was acceptable, like he wasn't surprised. "How?" he said. She didn't answer because the honest answer was, "I don't know yet," and she wasn't willing to say that to a stranger who'd already heard enough. He straightened up, adjusted his hat. "I'm staying at the Denison boarding house through Sunday," he said, "in case you think of something." He left again. Emma stood behind her counter in the empty bakery in the middle of a hot Tuesday afternoon and tried to think of something. Wednesday, she found the second set of papers. She'd gone into her father's desk for the flour ledger. He kept it in the left-hand drawer, always had, and the ledger wasn't there. She pulled the drawer open further, and there, underneath a folded newspaper from March, was a document she hadn't seen before. She read it twice. Then she sat down on the floor of her father's study, which was something she hadn't done since she was very small, and read it a third time. It wasn't a lending agreement. It was a transfer document. Her father had signed over legal guardianship. Legal guardianship as though she were still a child, which she was not, which she had not been for 5 years, to Silas Briggs. The language was careful. The handwriting was a lawyer's handwriting. The date was 11 days ago. It had already been signed. Not on Friday. 11 days ago. She was already on paper Silas Briggs's ward. Emma sat on the floor for a long time. Then she stood up, put the paper back exactly where she'd found it, closed the drawer and walked back into the kitchen and started on the afternoon bread. Her hands moved automatically. Score the top. Slide it in. She knew the rhythm of this kitchen better than she knew anything else in the world, and right now, the rhythm was all she had. Think, she told herself. Think like there's a way out even if there isn't one. Think like the problem is solvable. Think. Guardianship could be contested, but that required a lawyer, which required money she didn't have, which required time she apparently had already run out of. She could leave, She could leave tonight before her father came home, and she could get on the stage and go where, with what she had $11.40 to her name, kept in a coffee tin behind the loose brick above the oven. She'd been saving it for 3 years. $11.40 did not take a person very far when that person had no family, no contacts, no references, and no way to explain why she'd left town without notice. She could go to the sheriff. She almost laughed at that. Sheriff Poole's office was 50 feet from Briggs's building. They ate lunch together twice a week. She had seen it herself. The bread came out right. She put it on the rack to cool. She thought about Jack Hawthorne saying, "I'm staying at the Denison boarding house through Sunday." She thought about what it meant that she was thinking about that. She went to the boarding house on Wednesday evening. She told herself she was just walking. She walked past the hardware store and the post office and the church, and then she turned down Maple Street, and the Denison house was there, a long white building with green shutters, and she stood outside of it on the sidewalk for a moment, and then walked up the front steps and asked Mrs. Denison if Mr. Hawthorne was in. He came downstairs in 3 minutes. He was in his shirt sleeves. He looked at her and said nothing. "Can we speak privately?" Emma said. He nodded toward the front porch. They went outside and stood at the railing, and the evening heat was still thick but softer now, and down the street someone was playing a fiddle badly. "I found something," Emma said, "in my father's papers." She told him about the guardianship transfer. He listened without interrupting. She watched his face, and his face didn't change much. A slight tightening around the jaw, a stillness in the eyes that was different from blankness. When she finished, he said, "When did you find it?" "This afternoon." "You came straight here?" "I went home first." She looked at the street. "I made the evening bread, then I came here." He was quiet for a moment. "You made the bread," he repeated. "Someone has to." He looked at her then with an expression she couldn't quite name. It wasn't pity. It was something quieter than pity. "All right," he said. "Tell me what you need. I need to know if there is any legal way to contest a guardianship transfer that's already been signed and filed." She said it the way she had rehearsed it on the walkover, clearly without trembling. "I need to know if there's anyone in this county or the next who isn't already in Silas Briggs's pocket. And I need to know—" She stopped. "What?" "I need to know," she said more quietly, "if you actually know something useful, or if you're just a man who happened to hear something and has nothing to offer except sympathy." He didn't look offended. "I know a territorial judge out of Fort Mercer," he said. "His name is Aldridge. He doesn't owe Briggs anything because Briggs never got his claws into the federal circuit. And guardianship transfers can be challenged on the grounds of—" He paused, and she realized he actually knew this had thought about. It wasn't making it up on the spot. "On the grounds that the transferred party is a legal adult who was not present or informed during the agreement." Emma stared at him. "You knew about the guardianship transfer," she said. "I suspected there was something like it. Briggs doesn't work through simple debt collection anymore. He upgraded." "How do you know this much about how Silas Briggs operates?" Jack Hawthorne was quiet for a long moment. The fiddle player down the street hit a bad note and then stopped playing. "Briggs operated in Larimer County 3 years ago," he said finally. "My sister ran a boarding house there." Emma didn't ask the rest of that. She could hear the rest of it in the pause that followed, and asking seemed like the wrong kind of intrusion. "I'm sorry," she said. He nodded once. "So." Emma straightened. "A federal judge named Aldridge in Fort Mercer. How long would that take?" "Riding hard, I can be there and back with a response in 5 days. Friday is 2 days away." "Yes." She looked at him. He looked at her. "That doesn't work," she said. "No, it doesn't." The fiddle started up again better this time. Emma gripped the porch railing and thought very hard and very fast. "What else?" she said. "There's another option," he said. "It's less clean." "Tell me." He looked at her steadily. "Briggs's guardianship document only holds if you remain unmarried and without legal representation. A wife has a different legal standing than a ward, different set of protections." He paused. "A wife doesn't get transferred." Emma was very still. "Mr. Hawthorne?" "I'm not talking about sentiment," he said. "I'm telling you the law." "You are telling me," she said carefully, "that marriage would legally invalidate Briggs's transfer document." "In this territory, yes. A married woman cannot be placed under guardianship without her husband's explicit consent and a separate court proceeding. Briggs wouldn't bother. Too much legal exposure." Emma stared at the street for a long time. "You have until Friday morning," he said. "The magistrate opens at 8. She turned and looked at him fully. This man she had met 36 hours ago. This stranger from the mountains with the quiet eyes and the bread he'd bought to last the ride. "You'd have to ride back up to your claim by Sunday anyway," she said. "This changes your plans." "I said I'd help. This is significantly more than help." "Yes. And you're asking nothing in return." He met her eyes. "I'm not asking anything. I'm offering a legal transaction. You'd run my household up on the mountain. Cook keep the cabin manage stores. Same work as you're doing here, but the debt and the man holding it don't exist up there." "And when I want to leave," she said. "When you want to leave," he said, "you leave." Emma turned back to the street. She breathed the heavy summer air and thought about her father's signature drying on a document 11 days ago, and Silas Briggs's name beside it, and the Friday morning that was now less than 40 hours away. She thought about her $11.40 in a coffee tin. She thought about Mrs. Hale looking at her with sad eyes that never translated into anything useful. She thought about the bread she had made that afternoon. She had made it. She had made it the way she always made it, because the rhythm was the only thing that made sense, and she thought about what it meant to do the same work in a different place, on different terms, with the document that mattered being a different document entirely. 8 o'clock Friday morning, she said. "I'll be there," Jack Hawthorne said. She walked home without looking back. Thursday. Her father came into the kitchen at breakfast with a different face lighter. Somehow the way men look when they've convinced themselves that a terrible thing is actually a practical one. "Briggs sent word," Henry said. "He'll come at 10 tomorrow, wants everything settled before noon." "Is that so?" Emma said. She set a plate in front of him. Eggs, bread, the last of the cold ham. She had been up since 3:30. She had already baked 2 full batches, cleaned the prep table, and counted the stock. She had also packed very carefully into a single canvas bag 2 dresses, her mother's silver thimble, the coffee tin with the $11 her father's photograph from 1871, when he was still a man, she recognized, and the small leather-bound journal she'd been keeping since she was 16. Her father ate. He did not look at her. "You'll do well there," he said to his eggs. "Briggs runs a proper operation." "I know what kind of operation Briggs runs." "Emma, eat your breakfast, Papa." He looked up at her then. His face was all the things it was broken, afraid, ashamed, determined to pretend none of those were true. She had spent years being angry at him. She had spent years being afraid of him. Right now she looked at him across the table and felt something she hadn't expected, a flat, empty kind of sorrow that had no heat left in it. She did not tell him what she was going to do in the morning. She thought about telling him. She thought about the conversation, the shouting, the accusations, the possibility that he would go to Briggs tonight if he knew, the possibility that Briggs would come to the boarding house, and she thought about how her father's face would look when he realized what she'd done, and she thought that she could live with what his face would look like then. She cleared his plate when he was done. He went upstairs. She washed the dishes. She walked through the bakery one last time, ran her hand along the counter, looked at the oven, looked at the shelves. She had hated this room for years. She had also built her entire self inside it. She thought both things could be true. She picked up her bag. She walked out. The magistrate's office was on the corner of 2nd and Mill, a narrow building squeezed between the post office and a land surveying office, with a clerk who appeared startled to see 2 people walk in at 2 minutes past 8 on a Friday morning. Jack Hawthorne was already there when she arrived. He had shaved. She noticed that before anything else. He was in a clean shirt. his hat in his hand, standing in the small waiting room with the particular stillness of a man who had made a decision and was simply waiting for it to happen. Emma walked in. He looked at her. She looked at him. "You came," he said. "I said I would." The clerk, a young man named Tilden, who looked like he would rather be anywhere else, processed the paperwork in 22 minutes. The magistrate, a short, red-faced man named Geary, performed the ceremony in 8. There were no flowers. There were no guests. The window was open, and the heat was already building outside, and somewhere down the street, a dog was barking. Judge Geary said the words. Emma said the ones required of her. Jack Hawthorne said the ones required of him in a steady voice that didn't hesitate. Tilden signed as witness. It was done. Emma Whitaker stood in that small office and became on paper Emma Hawthorne, and felt with a clarity she hadn't expected that the piece of paper she was now holding was the first piece of paper in the last 3 years that had her best interests in it. Jack put his hat back on. "Horses are at the livery," he said. "If you're ready." She picked up her canvas bag. "I'm ready," Emma Hawthorne said. And she walked out of the magistrate's office into the summer morning of Oak Hollow, Colorado for the last time. And she did not look back at the bakery, and she did not look toward the clock that said 9:47, and she did not think about what Silas Briggs's face would look like in 13 minutes when he walked through a door she was no longer behind. She thought about the mountains. She had never seen them up close. She thought, "I'm about to." They were 2 hours out of Oak Hollow when Emma realized her hands had stopped shaking. She hadn't noticed them shaking in the first place, not at the magistrate's office, not when she'd signed her name, not when she'd walked to the livery and watched Jack Hawthorne saddle a second horse with the quiet efficiency of a man who'd done it 10,000 times. Her hands had simply been doing what they needed to do the way they always did, and somewhere on the trail between the valley floor and the first long climb into the foothills, they had gone still. She noticed it because she looked down at them on the reins and thought, there they are. Jack rode slightly ahead. Not far close enough that she could call out if she needed to, far enough that he wasn't crowding her. He hadn't said much since they left town. She hadn't either. There wasn't much to say yet, and she had the sense that he understood this, that silence between them wasn't something that needed to be filled. The horse he'd given her was a brown mare named, apparently, Clover. He'd said the name once at the livery, and the horse had turned her head, and Emma had filed it away. Clover moved steadily, sure-footed, unbothered by the climb. Emma was not a particularly experienced rider, but she was not helpless either. Her mother had kept a horse when Emma was small. She remembered enough. What she was thinking about as they climbed was her father's face when he came downstairs tomorrow morning and found the kitchen empty. She was thinking about whether he would feel relieved, which would be worse than anything else. She was thinking about Silas Briggs walking into an empty bakery at 10 o'clock this morning, and the look on his face which she would never see and which she was still, despite everything, satisfied about. She was thinking about the guardianship paper in that desk drawer with her father's signature on it and what it meant that a man could sign his living daughter into someone else's ownership as though she were a parcel of land, and what it meant that the only law in this territory that protected her from that was the law that said a husband's claim superseded a guardian's, which meant she had traded one kind of paper for another, and which meant she was not free exactly, she was just differently bound. She knew that. She had known it when she walked into the magistrate's office. She was thinking about whether it mattered. "You're thinking loud," Jack said without turning around. She looked at the back of his hat. "I didn't say anything." "No, but you've been riding like someone who's arguing with themselves for about 20 minutes. He slowed his horse enough that she came up alongside him. "Anything I should know?" "I'm wondering," she said, "what happens if this doesn't work?" "What part of it?" "Any of it. Briggs could contest it. He could file something. He could—" She stopped. "He's not going to accept this quietly. You know that." "No," Jack said. "He won't. And it won't matter." He said it without drama, like a man stating a trail condition. "The marriage is filed with the territorial clerk. That puts it in the federal record. Briggs can file whatever he wants. He's got county judges. He doesn't have federal jurisdiction. And you're Judge Aldridge. Aldridge knows what Briggs is. I wrote to him last year about my sister's situation. His jaw moved slightly. Didn't help her, but the correspondence exists. If Briggs pushes on this, Aldridge will push back harder. Emma looked at the trail ahead. You planned this. I prepared for the possibility. When you've been in Oak Hollow 4 days, he glanced at her. I've been watching Briggs for longer than 4 days. She let that sit for a moment. The horses moved. The trail curved upward between stands of pine, and the air was already cooler here than it had been in town cleaner, with a sharpness to it that made her feel like she was breathing properly for the first time in months. Why? She said. You came to Oak Hollow specifically for Briggs. For information about Briggs. There's a difference. His voice was even. After Larimer County, I started tracking where he moved. He operates in a pattern, moves into a town, finds the men with debt, gives them just enough rope to hang themselves, then pulls. Takes 3 years usually. Oak Hollow was the right age. Your sister, Emma said carefully. What happened to her? The trail narrowed, and he moved slightly ahead again, and for a moment she thought he wasn't going to answer. She signed a labor agreement, he said. Thought it was for 6 months. Language in the contract made it renewable at Briggs's discretion. By the time she understood what she'd agreed to, she'd been working his boarding house for 2 years, and every dollar she made went to fees he invented. He paused. She got out eventually. Married a man from Pueblo. She's fine now. Another pause. She wasn't fine for a while. Emma said nothing. The kind of nothing that meant, I understand, and I'm not going to make you say more. So, he said, tone shifting slightly. Returning to practical ground, the way she was beginning to understand he did, move toward the operational when the personal got too close. You bake. Yes. Good. The supply runs to town are monthly, sometimes longer in winter. I can bring flour, salt, sugar, dried goods. Fresh meat I handle. We have a smokehouse and a root cellar. Anything else you think you'll need, write it down and I'll get it next run. You live entirely alone up there? Yes. How long? 6 years. She thought about 6 years alone on a mountain and didn't say what she was thinking about it. How many rooms? She said instead. Main room with the fireplace, the kitchen corner sleeping loft. Separate smaller room off the back that was a storage room. I cleared it out. He said this last part in a tone that was careful and factual. It's yours. Has a door with a latch. She looked at him. He kept his eyes on the trail. Thank you, she said. He nodded. They rode for another hour without talking, and it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that has some respect in it. They stopped at midday at a creek crossing to water the horses, and Emma climbed down and stretched her back and drank from her canteen while Clover put her nose in the water. Jack checked the horses' shoes and then crouched at the creek's edge and refilled his own canteen, and they stood there in the shade of the bank for a few minutes doing nothing in particular. Tell me something about the claim, Emma said. He looked up. What do you want to know? Anything. I'm going to live there. I'd like to know more than sleeping loft and root cellar. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile, it didn't get that far, but a loosening around the eyes. It's about 900 feet above the valley, he said. High meadow on the east side, timber to the north and west. Creek runs about 50 yards from the cabin, that's your water source. The smokehouse is good, the wood pile's well stocked. I spent most of June cutting. He straightened up. Nearest neighbor is a homesteader named Calhoun about 4 miles south. He's got a wife and 2 boys. They're decent people. Does Calhoun know about... She gestured vaguely. He'll know what he needs to know when we get there. Jack capped his canteen. Which is that I've got a wife now. The word sat in the air between them. Wife. Printed on a form in a county clerk's office. Said aloud in a magistrate's office by a man in a clean shirt. A word she had never applied to herself, and now it meant something specific and legal and strange. Will he ask questions? Emma said. Calhoun, no. He's not the asking type. Good. She looked at the creek. I'm not sure I have answers yet. He made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. Low, short, genuine. She looked at him, slightly surprised, and he had already looked away. "Let's move," he said. "Want to make the upper trail before sundown." Look, they didn't make the upper trail before sundown. They made it in the dark, which was its own kind of arrival, the cabin appearing out of the black tree line as a shape, and then a solid thing, the smell of cut pine and wood smoke, a structure that had clearly been built by someone who cared more about function than appearance, and had managed to achieve both anyway. Jack got the horses settled in the small lean-to stable. Emma carried their bags inside. The first thing she did by herself, before he came in from the stable, was find the fireplace and light it. He'd left everything she needed, tinder kindling, the long matches in a tin on the mantel. She'd been lighting fires her whole life. She had the fireplace going in 4 minutes. She was standing in front of it with her hands out when Jack came in. He stopped in the doorway. He looked at the fire, then at her. "I can show you how the stove works in the morning," he said. "I'll figure it out tonight," she said. He looked at her again with that expression she was starting to recognize, the one that was taking note of her, filing her away, updating some internal record he was keeping. "All right," he said. He showed her where everything was: supplies, tools, the water bucket, the oil for the lamps, in a practical, thorough inventory that took about 10 minutes and felt like a briefing. She asked 2 questions. He answered both. Then he said good night and went up to the loft, and she went through the door at the back and found her room, which was small and clean, and had a window and a cot with 2 wool blankets and a latch on the door. She latched it. She sat on the cot in the mountain dark and listened to the sounds of a place she had never been before. The wind in the timber, the creek in the distance, a sound that might have been an owl. And she thought, "I am 23 years old, and today I got married and rode 900 feet up into the mountains. And I do not know this man, and I do not know this place." She also thought, "Silas Briggs does not own me." She laid down with her boots on and slept before she meant to. She woke before 4 out of pure habit. The cabin was dark and cold, the fire burned down to coals. She built it back up. She found the kitchen corner and examined it properly for the first time. Cast iron stove, good solid work surface, a shelf of dry goods, organized with a precision that surprised her. He kept a clean house. She found coffee beans and a grinder, and made coffee, and by the time Jack came down from the loft, the cabin smelled like something that might almost pass for ordinary. He stopped at the bottom of the loft ladder. She held out a tin mug. He took it, sat at the table, drank it, said nothing. She poured her own and sat across from him, and they drank their coffee in the gray early morning of the mountain. And neither of them said anything, because apparently they were both people who did not talk before coffee, and she thought, well, there is one thing we have in common. Then he said, "I need to check the trap lines today. I'll be gone most of the morning. All right?" The stove's straightforward, burns even on the right side. He looked at her over the mug. "You don't have to cook. There's dried meat on the shelf." "I'll cook," she said. He nodded. "Don't go past the tree line to the north without telling me first. There's a bear that's been coming through." "I'll stay in." He finished his coffee and stood, and that was the whole morning conversation. He took his rifle from the rack by the door and went out, and she sat with her coffee and looked at the cabin that was now by the law of a piece of paper her home, and tried to figure out what that meant. She spent the morning learning the stove. He was right that it burned even on the right, the left ran hot, and she adjusted. She found a sack of cornmeal and made a proper pan of cornbread from memory, and then, because she'd found dried beans and salt pork and had time, she started a pot of soup. She swept the floor. She took stock of the supplies, properly making a list in her journal of what was there, what was running low, what was missing. She was not trying to prove anything. She was just doing what she knew how to do, because when you don't know a place yet, the best thing you can do is make yourself useful in it. Jack came back at midday with 2 rabbits and stopped in the doorway and looked at the cabin and looked at her. She said, "Soup's ready." He hung up the rabbits and washed his hands and sat down, and she put a bowl in front of him and he ate about half of it before he said, "This is good." "It's just beans. It's the best beans I've had in 6 years," he said, without apparent drama or flattery, as though he were simply reporting accurate information. She sat across from him and ate her own bowl and didn't say anything about that. Did. 3 days passed in which Emma learned the cabin's rhythms, the way she had learned every other place she'd lived, by watching, by trying things, by making mistakes and fixing them. She burned the first loaf of bread she made in the mountain stove, because the altitude changed the baking and she hadn't accounted for it. She stood over the failed loaf and was briefly intensely furious, not at the bread, not at the stove, but at the general fact that even the skills she'd spent a lifetime building needed to be relearned in a new place. Then she adjusted the temperature and the time and tried again, and it came out right. Jack, who had come in from splitting wood as she was pulling the second loaf out, looked at it, and then looked at the first loaf sitting on the side counter, the failed one, and then looked at her. "Learning curve," she said. "Altitude does it," he said. "Takes everything longer." "I know that now." He cut a slice from the good loaf and ate it standing at the counter and said, "That's right," which she was starting to understand was as close as he got to enthusiastic. The evenings were the strange part. Not bad. Strange, just the particular strangeness of two people who didn't know each other sharing a space and trying to navigate it with dignity. After supper, Jack would read or work on equipment, and Emma would write in her journal or mend something, and the firelight would make the whole cabin warm and small, and several times she caught herself thinking that it looked from the outside like something that it wasn't yet. On the fourth night, he looked up from what he was reading and said, "You've been checking the door." She looked up. "What?" "The front door. You check it when you think I'm not looking, before you go to bed." She set down her pen. He was right. She hadn't realized she was doing it. Old habit, checking the door when her father was in a mood, making sure the latch was solid. "Sorry," she said. "Force of habit." He looked at her for a moment. "Nothing to be sorry for. It's not—" She stopped. "I know the door is fine. I'm not afraid of you." "I know you're not." He went back to his book. "But check it if you want to. That's what latches are for." She looked at him, this man who had given her his name and a room with a latch on the door, and said she could leave whenever she wanted, and felt something complicated move through her. Not the big kind of feeling. A smaller kind. The kind that comes from a very specific small kindness that you weren't expecting and don't quite know what to do with. She went back to her journal. She checked the door. On the 5th day, riders came. 2 of them picking up the trail from the south, and Clover shifted and made noise in the lean-to before Emma heard anything else. Jack was already at the window by the time Emma came out of her room. "Stay inside," he said. "Who is it?" He watched for a moment. "Don't recognize them yet." She looked over his shoulder. 2 men on horseback coming up the trail at a deliberate pace, not rushing, which was somehow worse than rushing. Rushing would mean urgency. This was something else. This was the pace of men who had all the time they needed. "The big one on the left," Emma said quietly. "He works for Briggs. I've seen him in the bakery." Jack turned and looked at her. "You're sure? His name is Delbert. He used to deliver Briggs's collection notices." She kept her voice steady. "He's here because Briggs sent him." Something changed in Jack's face. Not fear. The opposite of fear, a kind of settling in, like a man who has been waiting for something to start. "Then that's where we are," he said. "What do we do?" He picked up his rifle from the rack. "Not in a hurry, matter of fact, like picking up a tool for a tool's job. You let me handle the talking," he said. "You stand where they can see you, but back from the door. You don't speak unless I ask you to." "And if they—" "Emma." He looked at her. "I've been waiting for Silas Briggs to send someone to this mountain for 6 years. I know what I'm doing." She looked at him. This man she'd known for 8 days. This person who had shaved for her wedding and made sure her room had a latch and had apparently spent 6 years preparing for exactly this moment, and she made a decision. "All right," she said. "Talk." He opened the door. The two riders stopped at the edge of the yard. Delbert was exactly who she'd said he was. Large, flat-faced, the kind of man who made a good collection. Notice deliverer because he didn't need to say anything. The second man was smaller in a better coat, holding himself with a particular kind of authority that came from legal paperwork rather than physical size. "Jack Hawthorne," the smaller man said. "That's right. My name is Garrett Cole. I represent Silas Briggs of Oak Hollow in matters of civil dispute." He produced a document from his coat. "Mr. Briggs has filed a contested transfer claim with the county court. He has a valid guardianship document signed by one Henry Whitaker dated—" "Filed with the county court," Jack said, "not the territorial court." Cole paused. "Correct. The county, which doesn't have jurisdiction over a federally recorded marriage." Jack's voice didn't rise. Didn't need to. "Emma Hawthorne is a married woman. The guardianship transfer your client filed is legally null. County court can't touch a federal marriage record." Cole's expression tightened. "Mr. Briggs's legal team believes the timeline of the marriage is—" "The marriage was filed at 8:22 on Friday morning," Jack said. "The time is on the document. What time did your client attempt to collect—" A pause. "That's not, because if it was after 8:22, and I believe it was because your client said 10 o'clock, then there's nothing to contest. The marriage preceded the collection attempt. The guardianship was null before Briggs ever knocked on that door." He paused. "If Mr. Briggs has questions about how federal law applies to his county filings, he's welcome to write to Judge Aldridge out of Fort Mercer. I've corresponded with the judge before. I'm happy to do so again." Silence. The mountain wind moved through the yard. Delbert hadn't said a word. Cole was looking at his document like it had somehow failed him personally. "Mr. Briggs won't accept this," Cole said. "That is between Mr. Briggs and the federal court system," Jack said, "neither of which are my problem." Emma stood in the cabin doorway. She had not spoken. She had barely moved. But she held herself straight, her hands still at her sides, and she looked at the man who had come up this mountain to try to take her back, and she did not look away. Cole looked at her, then back at Jack. He put the document back in his coat. "Mr. Briggs will pursue this," he said. "I expect so," Jack said. "Good day, Mr. Cole." A long moment. Then Cole turned his horse. Delbert followed. They rode back down the trail the way they'd come, steady, deliberate, not rushing. Jack stood in the doorway until they were out of sight. Then he turned around. Emma let out a breath she'd been holding for what felt like several minutes. "Aldridge," she said. "You actually wrote to him before." "I told you I did." "You made it sound like a threat." "It was a fact," Jack said. "Facts and threats sometimes sound the same." She looked at him. "Is this over?" He set the rifle back on the rack. "For today. And tomorrow." He turned. "Briggs doesn't give up easily. He'll file something. He'll try another angle." He met her eyes. "But he'd have to get through federal law, a territorial judge, and this mountain to get to you. That's not impossible, but it's not easy." A pause. "And I don't make it easy. Emma stood in the doorway of a mountain cabin looking at a man who had in the span of 8 days married her and paid down her father's debt and turned away a legal representative of the man who'd tried to own her. She thought about what she owed him. She thought about what they were to each other. She thought about what wife meant and what it didn't mean and what the space between those two things looked like. "Thank you," she said. "Again." "You don't have to keep thanking me," he said. "I know." She went back inside. "But I'm going to." She went to the stove and started on supper, and he came inside and sat at the table and picked up his book, and the mountain evening settled around the cabin like it had always done, and outside on the trail, 2 men rode back to town with nothing to show for the trip. It was quiet for a week after that. Then the letter came. A writer from the Calhoun homestead 4 miles south brought it up on a Wednesday folded paper delivered with a nod, and no particular comment, because Calhoun's people minded their business the way Jack had said they did. Jack looked at the handwriting on the outside and handed it to Emma without opening it. "It's yours," he said. She looked at it. It was her father's handwriting. She took it outside and sat on the step in the afternoon sun and held it for a while before she opened it. The letter was short. Henry Whitaker had never been a man of many words on paper. He wrote that he'd heard what she'd done and that Briggs was furious, and that he, Henry, had been told to expect no further business from Briggs's associates, which was apparently a significant portion of the bakery's traffic. He wrote that he did not understand her reasoning. He did not write, "I'm sorry I signed that paper." He did not write, "I should have protected you." He wrote at the end in handwriting that looked older than she remembered, "I hope the mountain is treating you well. Your mother would have been glad you got out." Emma sat with that sentence for a long time. It was the most honest thing her father had said to her in 3 years. She didn't know what to do with it, except to fold the letter carefully and put it in her pocket and go back inside. Jack was at the table, not pretending not to have waited. "You all right?" he said. "My father," she said. "He says my mother would have been glad." He didn't say anything. "I think he's right," she said. "And I think that's the closest he'll ever get to admitting what he did." She looked at her hands. "Which is going to have to be enough because there isn't going to be anything else." Jack set down his pen. "Some men only have the one thing in them," he said, "the small true thing, and they can't get past it to the larger one." She looked at him. "Is that from experience?" He held her gaze for a moment. "Yes." She wanted to ask him more. She didn't, because she was learning the same thing about him that she was apparently learning about her father, that there were things just visible enough to see and not close enough to touch, and that pushing didn't make them closer. She took the letter out and read the last line again. "Your mother would have been glad you got out." "Jack," she said. "Yeah. I'm going to need more flour. I want to try that sourdough again." He almost smiled. He didn't quite, but she could see the edge of it. "I'll get it on the next supply run," he said. She put the letter away. She went to the stove. Outside the mountain held them both in the particular quiet of a place that doesn't know about debt or guardianship papers or the names people sign on things, and the creek ran 50 yards from the cabin the way it always had, and the afternoon moved west, and Emma Hawthorne stood at a stove in the high country and made something out of what she had. Which was, she was beginning to understand exactly what she had always done. And she was also beginning to understand no small thing. The second letter from her father arrived on a Monday, and it was not like the first one. Emma knew before she opened it. The handwriting on the outside was shakier than she remembered the letters pressing too hard into the paper the way her father's hand did when he was afraid. She stood in the cabin doorway with the morning light behind her and looked at it for 3 seconds, and then opened it. Henry Whitaker wrote 5 sentences. Briggs had closed his account at the dry goods store. Briggs had spoken to the mill, and the mill would no longer extend credit to the bakery. 2 of the bakery's longest customers had stopped coming in the same week, and Henry did not think that was a coincidence. He was behind on his lease by 1 month, and the landlord, a man named Porter, who had 3 properties financed through Briggs's lending office, had sent a notice. The 5th sentence said, "I think he means to take the bakery." Emma. "I don't know what to do." She read it twice, folded it, put it in her apron pocket. Jack was at the woodpile when she came outside. He was working with that particular focused economy she had come to recognize in him. No wasted motion, no pausing, just the steady rhythm of a man who understood that the work was the work. "My father," she said. He set the axe down. She handed him the letter. He read it standing there, one hand on the axe handle, and his expression did the thing it did. The tightening, the stillness, the internal calculation she could see working behind his eyes without being able to read the numbers. "He's squeezing the bakery," Jack said. "Briggs, yes." She crossed her arms. "He can't get to me, so he's going after what my father has left. That's how he works when the direct route closes." He handed the letter back. He makes the person who helped you suffer until you come back to solve it. I know. Her voice was flat. I know exactly what he's doing. Emma, if I go back, it stops. She said it out loud because it needed to be said out loud, and handled not left as an unspoken pressure building in the room. I know that. I'm not going back. But I need to say that clearly so we can move past it and figure out what's actually useful. He looked at her for a moment. All right. Is there anything legal we can do from here? Anything that protects the bakery? The bakery is your father's property. He'd have to initiate any legal action. He paused. But if Briggs is cutting off his supply lines and pressuring his landlord, that might constitute predatory interference, depending on the judge. Depending on whether the judge is Porter's judge or Aldridge's. Yes. She looked at the mountain above them. The timber ran dark green against the sky, and the morning was cool and clean and completely indifferent to Silas Briggs and everything he was doing 2,000 feet below. Write to Aldridge, she said. Tell him what's happening. Not because it'll stop Briggs, it won't stop him, not yet, but because I want it on record. I want every move he makes documented with someone who isn't in his pocket. I can do that. Today. Today, he agreed. She went back inside and started the bread and tried not to think about her father standing alone in an empty bakery, not knowing what to do, which was a thing he had never admitted to her before in her life, and which landed somewhere complicated and unwanted in her chest. She kneaded the dough harder than she needed to. The bread came out fine. The Calhouns came for supper that Saturday, which was the first time Emma had seen other people in 3 weeks, and it was stranger than she expected. Not unwelcome, but strange, the way returning to any version of ordinary life is strange after you've been living outside it. Ruth Calhoun was a sturdy, sun-weathered woman, about 15 years older than Emma, with a direct way of speaking that Emma liked immediately. She brought a pie and 2 jars of preserved plums, and shook Emma's hand at the door, like a woman who assessed people quickly and had already made a preliminary judgment. So you're the one who got Hawthorne to clean the south window, Ruth said, looking past Emma into the cabin. Emma glanced at the window. She had cleaned it 10 days ago because the grime was cutting the afternoon light. I cleaned all the windows, Emma said. Ruth looked at her husband, a broad, quiet man named Cal, who was already shaking Jack's hand and appeared to have no opinion about windows. She'll do, Ruth said to no one in particular. They ate at the table, Emma's cornbread, Ruth's pie, a venison roast that Jack had been tending since morning without mentioning it until she smelled it, and the conversation was easy, in the way that genuine country conversations are easy built on practical things and not on performance. The 2 Calhoun boys, 9 and 11, ate enormous quantities of everything and said almost nothing, which Emma appreciated. Halfway through supper, Ruth said, Heard you had some trouble from town. Emma looked up. Cole and that big man, Ruth said. They stopped at our place on the way up, asked if we'd seen you. Emma set down her fork. What did you tell them? Told them we hadn't been up this trail in a month. Ruth said this with the complete calm of a woman who lied to unpleasant people without moral difficulty. They didn't believe me particularly, but they couldn't prove otherwise. Ruth. Cal said it mildly, the way a man says a word he's said 10,000 times. They were Briggs's men, Ruth said. I didn't feel obligated to be helpful. Jack across the table said nothing, but Emma caught the slight shift in his posture that she was learning to read as approval. Thank you, Emma said. Truly. Ruth waved it off. Briggs tried to put a lien on Cal's Northfield 2 years ago. We have our own reasons. She looked at Emma directly. You holding up all right, Mountain, takes some getting used to. I'm adjusting. Adjustment's harder than people say. Ruth's voice dropped a register, losing its brisk edge. First winter up here, I cried every day for 6 weeks. Cal thought I was dying. Cal said, I thought she was dying. I was not dying, Ruth said. I was adjusting. She looked at Emma. The point is, it gets solid. Takes a season, maybe 2. but it gets solid. Emma looked at her plate. She thought about the word solid, about what it would feel like to have the mountain feel solid under her feet instead of new and foreign and provisional. "I'll take your word for it," she said. Ruth patted her hand once efficiently and reached for more cornbread. It got solid in some ways faster than Ruth had suggested. Not because the mountain changed. The mountain stayed exactly as indifferent and demanding as it had been from the first morning, but because Emma changed in the specific incremental way of someone learning a place by living in it, rather than visiting it. She learned that the left side of the stove ran hot and the right ran cool, and the sweet spot for bread was a specific combination of both that she had worked out through 12 attempts. She learned that the creek was highest in early morning and clearest by late afternoon. She learned that Jack moved differently before a storm, quieter, more deliberate, spending an hour checking the stable roof and the woodpile, and that this was a more reliable weather indicator than anything she could see in the sky. She learned that he read until very late at night, long after the fire burned low, and that if she came out for water after midnight, he would look up and say nothing, just wait to see if she needed anything, and if she didn't, he would go back to his book. She learned that this was his version of companionable. She was beginning to find it easier than other versions she had known. She wrote in her journal most evenings. She did not write about feelings particularly. That was not how she had ever written, even as a girl. She wrote practical things, what she had made, what she had learned, what needed doing. Occasionally, she wrote down things people said that seemed worth keeping. She wrote down what Ruth Calhoun had said about adjustment. She wrote down what Jack had said about men with only the one small true thing in them. She did not write down the way she was becoming aware of him in a different way. Not with alarm, not with the particular alertness she'd once had to her father's moods, but with a different kind of attention. The awareness of a person who existed in your space as a solid presence rather than a threat. She noticed his hands on the axe handle. She noticed that he hummed very quietly when he was doing methodical work, not a tune she could identify, just sound. She noticed that he had 3 books he read in rotation, and that when he finished the third, he started the first again, which suggested either a limited library or a particular kind of mind that trusted the familiar. She did not write any of that down. It was not the right time for that kind of writing. The third week of August brought the heat back in a final surge before fall, and with it came the rider from Oak Hollow that Emma had been half expecting and half dreading for weeks. Not Briggs's man this time. This rider came from the opposite direction, which meant he'd known the back trail, which meant he was someone who'd been to the claim before. He was an older man, gray-bearded in a coat that had seen considerable country, and he gave his name as Mathers, and said he was a federal land agent out of the territorial office in Denver. Jack met him at the edge of the yard. Emma watched from the doorway. "Hawthorne," Mathers said by way of greeting. "Mathers." Jack's voice was careful. "Been a while." 3 years. Mathers swung down from his horse without being invited, which told Emma he'd been here before, and felt he had standing to do that. "Got your letter to Aldridge. He sent me." "Fast." Aldridge moves fast when Briggs is involved. Mathers glanced at Emma. "This your wife?" "Yes," Jack said without hesitation, and the word was so immediate and easy that Emma felt something shift slightly in her chest. "Ma'am?" Mathers touched his hat brim. "Mr. Mathers." She came out of the doorway. "Can I get you coffee?" "I'd be grateful." They sat at the table, the 3 of them, and Mathers drank his coffee and laid out what he'd come to say in the direct way of government men who traveled long distances to say things and didn't want to waste the trip. Aldridge had been building a case against Silas Briggs for 14 months. Mathers said this plainly, without drama, like a man reading a supply list. The guardianship fraud in Oak Hollow. Emma's situation was not the first such document they'd identified. There were 3 others in 2 counties, all following the same pattern. Henry Whitaker's signature was one of 4. The women involved were at different stages of Briggs's system, some already in his boarding house operations, one who had managed to leave with her sister's help. Emma sat very still, and listened to a federal agent describe what had almost happened to her as though it were case evidence, which it was, and tried to locate the right feeling about that. "We need Mrs. Hawthorne's statement," Mathers said. "Formal one notarized detailing the sequence of events, the guardianship document, the timeline, the collection attempt." He looked at her. "You'd be the strongest case. You got out with paperwork intact and dated. The others, the documentation's murkier." "She'd be named in the proceedings," Jack said. "Yes, her name would appear in the filing. Briggs would know." "Briggs already knows who she is," Mathers said evenly. "He sent a man to this mountain. Her name's not a secret to him. The question is whether her name goes into a record that works against him or just sits in the territory as an irritant." Emma looked at Mathers. "What happens to the women already in his boarding house if the case proceeds?" Mathers set down his coffee. He looked at her the way people look when the question being asked is a better question than they expected. "Labor agreements get voided," he said. "If we can prove the documents were signed under coercive conditions, debt pressure misrepresented terms, then the agreements are unenforceable. The women aren't bound. And their debt? That gets complicated." "It's always complicated for the women," Emma said. Mathers looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "Yes, ma'am, it is. We're working on that part." She looked at Jack. He was watching her, not guiding her, not signaling, just watching, waiting to see what she decided, which she was beginning to understand, was entirely characteristic of him. "I'll give you the statement," Emma said. Mathers reached into his coat for paper. "All of it," she said. "Every detail I remember from the date the first lending notice came to the day I left. The guardianship document, my father's signature, the timeline to the minute." She leaned forward. "And I want to know when the case goes to Aldridge. I want to know what happens." "I can arrange that," Mathers said. "Then let's start." She gave him 3 hours of statement. She was precise and thorough, and she did not soften anything. She described her father's signature on the guardianship transfer with the same level voice she used for everything else. She described what she had understood Briggs's saloon operation to be and what had been explicitly proposed. She described Cole and Delbert riding up the mountain trail and what Jack had said to them and what time it had been. Mathers wrote all of it. When she finished, he capped his pen and looked at her with an expression she recognized, the same expression Ruth Calhoun had worn when she'd said she'll do the expression of someone updating an estimate upward. "You'd make a good witness," he said. "I'm aware," Emma said. He left before dark with a notarized document in his coat and coffee still warm in his stomach, and Emma stood in the doorway and watched him go down the trail and felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. The specific satisfaction of having done a thing that mattered beyond herself. Jack came to stand beside her. "That was brave," he said. "It was practical," she said. "Those aren't mutually exclusive." She looked at him. He was looking down the trail, and the evening light was doing something to the angle of his face that made him look older and more tired and more real than he usually allowed himself to appear. "Will the case actually reach Aldridge?" she said. "Or is this the kind of thing that gets stalled in county court for years? With Mathers carrying the file directly, it reaches Aldridge." He paused. "That's why Aldridge sent him and not a letter. He trusts Mathers to bring things back intact. And Briggs will find out about the statement, probably within a week. And then..." Jack was quiet for a moment. "And then we'll see what kind of man he is when he's cornered." "I know what kind of man he is when he's cornered," Emma said. "The same kind he is every other time, except more." He nodded. "Yes." The light faded and they went inside and she made supper, and they ate, and neither of them said what they were both thinking, which was that the chess piece had moved and the response would come and the mountain would have to be enough. It came faster than a week. 4 days after Mathers left, Jack came in from the trap lines earlier than usual. Emma heard Clover before she heard him, the mare making the particular sound she made when something on the trail had unsettled her. She had the rifle off the rack before Jack came through the door. He looked at her holding it and said, "Good." What happened? Saw two men at the lower creek crossing. They weren't hunters. He took the rifle from her, checked the load out of habit, handed it back. They were watching the trail up. Briggs escalated. Looks that way. He crossed to the window. We've got time. They were still well below. Emma stood in the middle of the cabin with the rifle in her hands and ran through it quickly in her head. Two men. One trail up. One trail that Mathers had come from the back route, which meant there might be people who knew it and people who didn't. The Calhouns 4 miles south. Ruth, she said. He turned. If those men ask at the Calhoun place, Cal can handle himself. I know Cal can handle himself. I'm thinking about what they might tell Briggs if they can't. She set the rifle on the table. We need to get word to Ruth. Jack was already thinking the same thing. She could see it. I can ride the back trail, 40 minutes. And leave me here. A pause. Emma, I'll go with you. Both of us, both horses, back trail, warn the Calhouns, and don't come back here until we know what those men intend. She looked at him. There's nothing in this cabin worth staying in this cabin for. He looked at her for 2 full seconds. You can ride fast, he said. Faster than you'd expect, she said. They were on the horses in 6 minutes. The back trail was narrow and steep, and Emma rode it hard behind Jack, trusting Clover's feet more than she trusted her own judgment about the terrain, leaning forward and letting the horse work. Her heart was running fast, but her mind was quiet, the same way it had been quiet on the morning she walked into the magistrate's office, the same way it had been quiet when she read the guardianship document on her father's floor. Fear didn't make her freeze. She'd learned that about herself early and confirmed it often. They came out behind the Calhoun homestead in 35 minutes. Ruth was in the yard when they rode in. She looked at their faces and said, "How much time do we have?" "Enough," Jack said. "2 men at the lower crossing. Don't know if they'll come your way." "They will," Ruth said, with a certainty that said she'd been expecting something like this since the day Emma arrived on the mountain. Porter told Cal last week that Briggs was asking about the homesteads up here, wanted to know if anyone was sheltering the Hawthorne woman. She said the Hawthorne woman with a deliberate emphasis that made clear she considered it an honorable thing to shelter. Emma heard it and felt it land. "We don't want to put you in a position," she started. "Oh, be quiet," Ruth said, not unkindly. "Cal." She called toward the barn. "Cal, come out here." Cal Calhoun came out of the barn the way he always appeared, solid, unhurried, like a man who had decided to be unflappable and had stuck to it for 30 years. He looked at Jack. He looked at Emma. He looked at the direction they'd come from. "Briggs's men," he said. "Probably," Jack said. Cal scratched his jaw. "Well, they're welcome to knock. I'll tell them what I told the last ones." He paused. "Which is the same thing Ruth told them." "Which is that you haven't seen us," Emma said. "Which is that we live here quietly and mind our affairs and don't know anything about anything that happens above the lower crossing." Cal said this with the grave innocence of a man who had been minding his affairs all his life and found it generally useful. Emma looked at these two people, this woman with plum preserves and a direct manner and no patience for Silas Briggs, this man with the barn and the quiet certainty, and felt the specific thickness in her throat that came from being helped by people who didn't have to help. "Why?" she said, and she heard the crack in her own voice and didn't hide it. "You don't owe us anything. Briggs could make your lives difficult too. He does it easily. You know that." Ruth looked at her steadily. "Porter tried to buy our Northfield at half price 2 years ago," she said. "He was acting for Briggs. We said no. Briggs put a lien on it anyway, claimed an old right-of-way. Took 8 months to clear." She paused. "That's what he does. He does it whether you cooperate with him or not. So you might as well not cooperate." She reached out and gripped Emma's arm once firmly. "Besides, I like you. You cleaned all the windows." Emma laughed. It came out strange, slightly ragged real. Jack behind her made the sound that wasn't quite a laugh but was close. They stayed at the Calhoun place until dark, when Jack was satisfied the men at the lower crossing had moved off or settled in for the night without coming up. Cal rode the lower perimeter himself in the late afternoon and came back reporting no sign of them. On the ride back up the trail in the dark, Jack said, "You're all right." Yes, she was. She was better than all right. She was keyed up and alert, and something in her was burning in a clean way like a fire with good wood under it. "You handled that well," he said. "The Calhouns handled it. We just warned them." "You decided to warn them," he said. Quickly, correctly. She rode behind him in the dark and didn't answer because she was thinking about something else, about what it meant that she had today thought faster than fear and acted before she could second-guess herself, and that the result had been exactly right. She was thinking about what the mountain was doing to her, whether the clean air or the hard work or the absence of her father's footsteps on the stairs was slowly rebuilding something in her that had been compressed for years. She was thinking that she felt on a dark trail on the side of a mountain, with two men possibly looking for her somewhere below more like herself than she had in a very long time. "Jack," she said. "Yeah. What do we do when Briggs himself decides to come?" Because she knew, with a certainty, she couldn't argue with that Cole and Delbert and the men at the crossing were escalating steps, and not the final one. Briggs had not yet expended his full resource. He hadn't needed to yet, or he was saving it, or he was letting the pressure build until something gave. Jack was quiet on the trail for a moment. "He won't come himself," he said finally. "Men like Briggs don't move in person when they're still feeling out the terrain. He'll send something legal, first try another filing, try a different angle with the county. When that doesn't hold..." He paused. "When that doesn't hold," Emma said, "then he'll come himself, or he'll send someone with real authority, and that's when it goes to Aldridge." He stopped his horse and turned. In the dark, she could barely make out the set of his jaw. "But I need you to understand something." "What?" "If he finds an angle we haven't thought of, if he files something creative, there's a possibility." He stopped again. "Say it," Emma said. "There's a possibility that the federal record isn't enough, that the marriage gets challenged on grounds we can't counter quickly from up here, and if that happens, then we go to Aldridge ourselves," Emma said. He looked at her. "We don't wait for Mathers or a letter or a rider from Denver. We ride to Fort Mercer ourselves, and we put the documents in Aldridge's hands directly." She held his gaze. "Yes, Fort Mercer is 3 days' hard ride. I know. In early September the weather could..." "Jack," she said it firmly. "Is that the plan if it comes to that?" He was quiet for a long moment. "Yes," he said. "That's the plan." She nodded. He turned his horse, and they rode the rest of the way in silence, and when the cabin came into view between the trees, she felt as she had begun to feel each time she returned to it, not relief exactly, but recognition. The particular sensation of a place that was becoming known to you. She was inside starting the fire when she heard him in the stable with the horses, and she thought about the day Mathers and the statement. The men at the crossing, Ruth Calhoun's hand on her arm, the ride in the dark, and thought that this was the shape of the fight now. Not the shape she'd imagined when she signed her name in the magistrate's office 3 weeks ago. Bigger, more complicated, more people in it than just her and one man with a legal document. She got the fire going. She put the kettle on. She heard Jack's boots on the step outside. The door opened, and he came in and stopped the way he always stopped, just inside the door, checking the room habit or instinct, or the years of living alone, making him careful about change. "Fire's good," he said. "Kettle's on," she said. He took off his coat, hung it by the door. And outside on the mountain, whatever Silas Briggs was preparing moved one day closer, and the stars above the timber were very bright and very cold, and in the cabin the fire held. The letter from Aldridge came on a Thursday, and it was not what Emma expected. She had expected a procedural update, a confirmation that Mathers had delivered the statement that the case was progressing, that the wheels of territorial law were turning in the slow, deliberate way that wheels of territorial law turned. She had expected something that would allow her to exhale partially and return to the rhythm of the mountain with a slightly lighter weight on her chest. What she got instead was a single page in a judge's precise handwriting that said in its third paragraph that Silas Briggs had filed a counterclaim in the territorial court. Not the county court, the territorial court, which meant he had found a lawyer good enough to get past the county level, challenging the validity of the marriage on the grounds that Emma Whitaker had been under legal guardianship at the time of the ceremony, and therefore lacked the legal standing to enter into a marriage contract without her guardian's consent. She read that paragraph 3 times. Then she walked outside and handed the letter to Jack without saying anything. He read it. His jaw tightened. "He found a territorial lawyer," she said. "Yes. Which means he's spending real money now, which means he's serious." He was always serious. Jack folded the letter. "He's escalating because the federal route scared him. He's trying to get ahead of Aldridge by filing first. Can he do that? Can he actually invalidate the marriage on those grounds?" Jack was quiet for a moment. That was 1 second too long. "Jack." "It's not a strong argument," he said, "but it's not nothing. Guardianship law is inconsistent across territories. If he finds a sympathetic clerk in the right office—" "He already has sympathetic clerks," Emma said. "That's been the entire problem from the beginning. At the county level, the territorial court is different. Is it different enough?" He met her eyes. "I don't know." She had not heard him say that before. In every conversation about Briggs and law and what was possible, he had been certain, careful, measured, but certain. He always knew the next move. She had built a significant portion of her sense of safety on this mountain around the fact that Jack Hawthorne knew the next move. She stood there and recalibrated. "Then we go to Fort Mercer," she said. "Like we said, Aldridge's letter says he wants us there anyway. Bottom of the page, he wants the original marriage certificate and both of us to give testimony. When? He sets a date of September the 14th. Emma counted. "That's 11 days. "Yes." "So we leave in the morning." He looked at her. "Emma, a 3-day ride each way with testimony in the middle. I want you to understand what that looks like. It's not comfortable. The mountain roads in September can be—" "I gave Mathers 3 hours of detailed statement," she said. "I can ride 3 days to give it to a judge in person." She held his gaze. "I'm not asking your permission. I'm telling you what I'm doing. I'm asking if you're coming with me." Something moved in his expression, the kind of movement that was too quick to catch fully there and gone like light through a shutter. "I'm coming," he said. "Good." She took the letter back. "Then we have tonight and tomorrow morning to prepare." "Wrapped and in," they told the Calhouns at first light. Ruth listened with her arms crossed and her face arranged in the expression Emma had come to recognize as her thinking face. Not worried, not alarmed, just processing. "How long?" Ruth said. "Week and a half, possibly 2, Jack said. "I need someone to check the stable and the smokehouse." "We'll check them," Cal said. "And if anyone comes up the trail—" "I know what to tell anyone who comes up the trail," Ruth said. She looked at Emma. "You all right?" "I will be," Emma said. Ruth studied her for a moment with those direct eyes. "You scared?" Emma thought about lying, decided against it. "A little," she said. Ruth nodded. "Good. Scared and moving is better than calm and stuck." She reached out and gripped Emma's hand once briefly. "You've got the right argument and the right man and a judge who already knows what Briggs is. That's not nothing." "No," Emma agreed. "It's not nothing." They rode out as the sun cleared the eastern ridge. The first day of riding was hard, in the way that the first day of hard things is always hard, not because anything specific went wrong, but because the body hasn't yet adjusted to the reality of sustained discomfort. Emma's back ached by afternoon. Her hands on the reins were sore. She did not say any of this. Jack set a pace that was fast but not punishing, and he checked on her twice without making a performance of it, glancing back, reading her posture the way she'd noticed. He read most things, deciding she was all right, and returning to the trail. At midday, they stopped at a creek to water the horses and eat, and Emma sat on a flat rock and looked at the country around her, which was different from the mountain, wider and more open, the land rolling out in long brown-gold distances, and thought about how small one person's problem was in the geography of a territory that went on for 1,000 miles in every direction. "You're doing it again," Jack said, thinking loud. "Quiet this time. That's sometimes worse." She looked at him. He was eating dried meat and watching the horses, and he looked in this moment like what he actually was. A man who had spent most of his adult life outdoors, who was comfortable in his own skin, in a way that had nothing to do with arrogance, and everything to do with long acquaintance with himself. "I was thinking about how Briggs has probably never worried about anything the way I've worried about this," she said. "He just files papers. He pays lawyers. He waits for people to run out of options and come back." "That's probably accurate." "It's infuriating. Yes, I want it to cost him something." She said it clearly without apology. "I want the case to cost him money and reputation and the ability to do this to whoever comes after me. I want the next woman he targets to be able to say there's a federal record and a precedent and a judge who already ruled against him." She paused. "Is that what Aldridge can actually do?" Jack set down his food. "If the case is solid, yes. A territorial ruling against Briggs's lending practices would follow him, would make it harder to operate in any territory that recognized the precedent." "How many territories does Aldridge cover?" 6. Emma picked up her canteen. "Then let's make it solid." He looked at her for a moment, with that expression, the one that was constantly updating its estimate of her, and said nothing, which she had learned was his form of agreement when he'd run out of arguments against something. They rode until the light failed, and camped where the trail widened near a stand of cottonwood, and Emma slept on the ground, wrapped in her bedroll, and woke stiff and sore, and already calculating the miles remaining. So, on the second day, they came down out of the high country into the valley proper, and the landscape changed, and the air changed, and Oak Hollow was somewhere to the northwest, close enough that Emma was aware of it, the way you're aware of something you don't want to look at directly. They didn't pass through it. Jack had planned the route to avoid the town entirely, swinging south through ranch country and picking up the Fort Mercer Road at a junction 18 miles out. It added 2 hours to the ride. Emma hadn't asked him to do this. He had done it. She noticed. She didn't say anything about it. What she said when they were far enough south that the junction was an hour ahead was, "My father is somewhere back there right now." "Yes," Jack said. "Probably in the bakery, or what's left of it. Probably." She looked at the road. "I keep expecting to feel more about that than I do." "What do you feel?" She thought about it honestly. "Sad. But not the kind of sad that wants to fix it. The kind that knows it can't be fixed and has accepted that." She paused. "Is that cold?" "No," he said. "That survived." She looked at him. He kept his eyes on the road, but he'd said it like he meant it precisely, not as comfort, but as accurate description, and she filed it away with the other things he'd said that were worth keeping. Fort Mercer was larger than Emma had expected, a proper territorial town, with a federal courthouse that had columns and everything, which struck her as both impressive and faintly absurd in the middle of all this open country. They rode in on the afternoon of the third day, found a boarding house on the south side of the main street, and Emma washed her face in the basin in her room and looked at herself in the mirror for the first time in weeks. She looked different, not worse, just different. The mountain summer had put color in her face, and her hands were stronger, and there was something in the set of her jaw that she recognized as the expression her mother had worn. Sometimes the expression of a woman who had decided something and wasn't undeciding it. She went to find Jack. He was already at the courthouse. Not inside the building, was closed for the evening, but on the steps talking to a man who turned out to be Mathers, who had apparently ridden ahead from somewhere and was waiting with the filed documents in a leather case under his arm. "Mrs. Hawthorne," Mathers said with what looked like genuine relief. "Good. Both of you here. Aldridge moved the meeting to tomorrow morning, 7 o'clock. He wants to review the filings before Briggs's lawyer arrives. Emma stared at him. Briggs's lawyer is coming here. Filed a motion to appear and present the counterclaim in person. Mather's expression was neutral in the way of a man who had seen this move before. It's a play. He wants to be in the room when Aldridge rules, in case there's any flexibility in the interpretation. Is there flexibility? Jack said. There's always flexibility somewhere. Aldridge knows where it is and where it isn't. Mathers looked between them. Get some rest. Tomorrow's going to be a long day. Emma lay in the boarding house bed that night and did not sleep for most of it. She ran through the statement she had given Mathers, looking for gaps. She thought about what Briggs's lawyer would argue. She thought about what she would say if Aldridge asked her questions directly in a courtroom with a high ceiling and columns outside, in front of a man with the authority to define what her marriage meant, and what her name meant, and what her life on that mountain was worth under the law. She thought about Ruth Calhoun's hand on her arm. She thought about Jack saying survived with the precision of someone who had used the word about himself first. She slept, eventually. Judge Aldridge was a small, thin man in his 60s, with the kind of stillness that came from decades of listening to people tell him things and deciding which parts mattered. He shook Emma's hand when she came in, which she hadn't expected from a federal judge, and looked at her for exactly the right amount of time, long enough to assess, brief enough to be respectful. Mrs. Hawthorne, he said, I've read your statement. I have questions. I'm ready, she said. Briggs's lawyer arrived at 7:15, a man named Holt from Denver. Silver-haired and smooth in the way of men who spend their lives in rooms with good furniture, making other people's problems manageable. He nodded at Aldridge and glanced at Emma and Jack with the professional disinterest of someone who had decided the opposition was not worth reading carefully. Emma watched him and thought, you are going to regret that. Aldridge opened with the timeline. He walked through every date, the guardianship document, the marriage, filing the collection attempt, with the methodical patience of a man building a structure he intended to stand in. Holt interrupted twice. Aldridge acknowledged both interruptions and continued. When he turned to Emma, he said, Mrs. Hawthorne, the counterclaim states that you were under active legal guardianship when you entered into the marriage agreement and therefore lacked the capacity to do so. In your own words, what was your understanding of your legal situation on the morning of Friday, August the 4th? Emma looked at him directly. My understanding, she said, was that a document had been signed by my father 11 days prior, without my knowledge or presence, purporting to transfer guardianship of a 23-year-old adult woman to a man she had not agreed to be transferred to. My understanding was that this document was legally questionable on its face because I am a legal adult who was neither present nor informed and who had not consented. My understanding was that the marriage I entered into on Friday morning was legal valid and executed before any collection attempt was made under the contested guardianship document. She paused. And my understanding was that a grown woman is not property regardless of what her father signs. Silence in the room. Holt said, Your Honor, the emotional argument doesn't address the legal. It was not an emotional argument, Emma said. It was a precise description of the timeline and my legal status at each point in it. Aldridge looked at her. Something in his expression shifted, barely perceptible, but she caught it. The same updating of an estimate that she'd seen on Ruth Calhoun's face and on Mather's face, and occasionally on Jack's. Mr. Holt, Aldridge said, I'm going to ask you to address the timeline directly. What time did your client's representative attempt to execute the guardianship transfer? Holt looked at his papers. The collection meeting was scheduled for 10 o'clock. Scheduled, Aldridge said. Was it executed? The property was not available. Because, Aldridge said, the marriage had been filed at 8:22 that morning, making the guardianship transfer null at the moment of collection. He closed the folder in front of him. Mr. Holt, your client filed a guardianship document over an adult woman without her knowledge or consent, which is of questionable legality in this territory to begin with. He then attempted to execute that document an hour and 38 minutes after it had already been rendered void by a legally recorded marriage. and he is now asking this court to retroactively validate a guardianship that was void before he tried to use it. He looked at Holt over his glasses. "I'm trying to find the legal argument here." Holt straightened. "Your Honor, the marriage itself can be contested on the grounds of—" "On what grounds?" The circumstances suggest coercion. A young woman under financial and familial pressure entering a sudden marriage contract." "Mr. Hawthorne," Aldridge said, turning to Jack, "did you coerce Mrs. Hawthorne into this marriage?" "No," Jack said. "Mrs. Hawthorne, were you coerced?" "No," Emma said. "I made a legal decision in my own interest with full understanding of what I was signing." "She was under duress," Holt said. "The financial situation." "People make legal decisions under financial pressure every day," Aldridge said, "including the decisions your client encourages them to make. If financial duress invalidated contracts, Mr. Briggs's entire lending operation would be void." He paused. "Which, incidentally, is something this court will be examining separately." Holt went still. Emma heard those words, "examining separately," and felt something loosen in her chest that had been tight since the morning she found the guardianship papers in her father's desk. "Your Honor," Holt said carefully now. "My client." "Your client," Aldridge said, "has a pattern of using guardianship documents as debt collection instruments across 4 counties and 3 territories, which my office has been documenting for 14 months. This case is the cleanest instance in the record because Mrs. Hawthorne had the presence of mind to preserve every document and provide a complete time-stamped account." He folded his hands. "The counterclaim is denied. The marriage stands. Mrs. Emma Hawthorne's legal status is that of a married adult woman, and no document filed by Silas Briggs or his representatives has any validity against that standing." He stamped the document. The sound was small and definitive, like a period at the end of a very long sentence. Holt gathered his papers without speaking. He looked at Emma once as he was leaving, a look that was not quite anger and not quite respect, but somewhere in the complicated territory between them. Then he left. Mathers was already writing. Aldridge looked at Emma and Jack across the table. "The broader case against Briggs's lending operation will take time. You understand that?" "Yes," Emma said. "The other women involved, the ones in his boarding house contracts, their situations are more complicated. The labor agreements have language that's going to require careful unwinding." He looked at her. "Your statement was the clearest documentation we have of how the operation works from the inside. It's going to matter." Emma nodded. "Is there anything you need from this court in the short term?" She thought about it. "A copy of today's ruling, certified, for our records." "You'll have it before you leave today." He stood, extended his hand to Jack first, then to Emma. "Mrs. Hawthorne, I'm sorry this was necessary." "I'm not," she said. "If it helps the others, I'm not sorry at all." He looked at her steadily. "It will." They were back on the road to the mountain by early afternoon, the certified copy of Aldridge's ruling in Emma's saddlebag next to her journal and her mother's silver thimble. The ride back was different from the ride there. Not easier. Her back still ached. Her hands were still sore, but different in the quality of the silence between them. The weight that had been riding alongside them for 3 days was not entirely gone, but it had changed shape. It was smaller, or perhaps she was larger. Jack rode beside her now instead of ahead, which he hadn't done on the way down. She noticed without commenting on it. At midday, at the same creek crossing where they'd stopped going south, they watered the horses again, and Emma sat on the same flat rock and ate and looked at the same wide country. "He said the other women's cases are more complicated," she said. "They are. Their contracts have layers. But they can be undone, with time. With Aldridge on it, yes, eventually." She turned the canteen in her hands. "I keep thinking about them. The ones already inside his operation, getting up every morning and going to work in a place they didn't choose with debt that doesn't shrink." She looked at the creek. "That was going to be me in 10 days. It wasn't. No. But the difference between them and me isn't that I'm smarter or braver. It's that I had 11 days warning, and a stranger walked into my bakery." She looked at him. "That's an incredibly thin line, Jack." He was quiet. "I know," he said. "I want to write to them," she said. "The other women. When the case proceeds, and their names become part of the record, I want to write to them. Tell them what I know. Tell them there's a judge and a federal record, and that their debt isn't a verdict." He looked at her for a long moment. "All right," he said. "You're not going to tell me it's not my business. It clearly is your business." He looked away. "You're better at it than you know. The testimony. Aldridge's face when you talked, he believed you not just because you were accurate, because you said the thing that needed saying, and you didn't dress it up." Emma looked down at her hands. She turned the canteen. "My mother used to say there was no point in saying a hard, true thing softly. People hear the softness and miss the truth." She was right. She was right about most things. She stood up. "I wish she'd been right that my father was a good man." Jack stood too. He was close enough that she could see the line of tiredness around his eyes, 3 days of hard riding, and 1 morning of high-stakes testimony in a federal courthouse, and he was still steady, still watching her the way he always watched her. "She might have been right about that too," he said. "Once." Emma looked at him. "That's a kind thing to say." "It's an accurate thing to say." He adjusted his hat. "There's a difference." She almost smiled. "There you go again." "What?" "Saying accurate when you mean kind." He looked at her a long, direct look and said nothing, and she felt something in the air between them that had been building for weeks without either of them naming it. And this was not the moment for naming it. They were standing at a creek crossing 2 days' ride from home, with everything still unsettled, and Briggs still operating in Oak Hollow, and 3 other women still working their way out of his contracts. But she felt it, and she thought from the way he looked at her that he felt it too. She picked up her bedroll. "Let's move," she said. "I want to make the high road before dark." He nodded, went to his horse. They rode. On the 3rd morning, the morning of the ride back up the mountain, Emma woke in the second boarding house they'd stayed in, a smaller place closer to the foothills, and lay in the gray early light and thought about what was waiting for her at the top of the trail. The cabin, the stove, the sourdough she'd been meaning to perfect, the journal with its pages of practical notes and occasional precise things, the creek 50 yards out the window, the view from the eastern meadow in the morning when the light came in low and turned everything gold for about 20 minutes before the day caught up with it. She thought about the latch on her door. She thought about coffee in a tin mug across the table from a man who hummed quietly when he worked and said accurate when he meant kind. She got up and dressed and went downstairs and started the water for coffee, and when Jack came down 4 minutes later, she already had the mugs out. He looked at the mugs. "You don't have to do that," he said. "I know," she said. "I wanted to. He sat down. She poured. They drank their coffee in the early morning of a town that wasn't theirs on the last day before they went home, and neither of them said anything for a while. Then Jack said, "When we get back, there's something I should tell you." She looked at him over her mug. "About the claim," he said. "About why I went to Larimer County after my sister, what I found when I got there." He was looking at the table, not at her. "I've been there are things about that time that are relevant to what we're doing now, that you should probably know if you're going to be part of this fight properly." Emma set down her mug. "Tell me now," she said. He looked up. "If it's relevant," she said, "and it sounds like it is, tell me now. We've got time before the horses are ready, and I'd rather know on the road than wait." He looked at her for a long moment. The same look, the same calculation, and then he said, "Briggs didn't just give my sister a bad contract." He paused. Emma waited. "He knew who she was," Jack said. "He came to Larimer County because he'd heard I had a claim up in the Gilpin Range, and he wanted the mineral rights. My sister was leverage. The whole operation in Larimer County was aimed at me. Specifically." His jaw was tight. I didn't know that until a year after she got out. Until Mathers told me. Emma stared at him. Briggs targeted your sister, she said slowly, to pressure you, to get to your land. Yes. And he moved to Oak Hollow, because I didn't sell. And he hasn't stopped. Jack's voice was even and steady and completely without softness. The legal campaign against him, me feeding information to Aldridge, the correspondence, all of it, part of it, is about the women, the lending operation. That's real, and it matters. But part of it is also he took something from my family, and I intend for there to be a reckoning. He met her eyes. I needed you to know that this isn't entirely altruistic on my part. That there are things I want from this case that are personal. The morning light in the window. The town waking up outside. Emma sat with what he'd said and turned it over completely. So am I, she said. He looked at her. Personal, she said. He signed my name onto a document without my knowledge. He tried to own me the way people own objects. He is currently squeezing my father's last livelihood to punish me for escaping. She held his gaze. Everything I'm doing is personal, Jack. I just also happen to want him to not be able to do it to anyone else. She picked up her mug. Those two things can both be true, for both of us. He looked at her for a long moment. Yes, he said. They can. Good. She finished her coffee. Now we understand each other completely. She stood. I'll get the horses. She was at the door when he said her name. She turned. He was still at the table, both hands around his mug, and he looked at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before. Open, slightly unguarded, like a man who had spent years keeping things close and was briefly voluntarily letting something show. Thank you, he said, for coming to Fort Mercer, for the testimony, for... He stopped, adjusted his course, for not making me do this alone. Emma stood in the doorway of a boarding house kitchen in the foothills of the Rockies, 2 days' ride from a mountain that was becoming her home, and looked at this man who had given her a legal name and a room with a latch and a fight worth being in. You weren't alone, she said. You haven't been for a while. She went to get the horses, and the mountain waited ahead of them, patient and high and indifferent in the way only very old things can be. And the trail home was there, and they rode it together. They came home to snow. Not a heavy snow, just the first thin layer of it. The kind that arrives in early September in the high country, like a rumor of what's coming, dusting the meadow and the woodpile and the stable roof, with something that looked almost decorative, until you understood it was a warning. Emma pulled Clover to a stop at the edge of the yard and looked at the cabin, and felt with a completeness she hadn't expected that she was looking at something that belonged to her. Not owned, not signed over, not transferred on a document without her knowledge. Belonged. The way a place belongs to a person who has learned it and worked it and chosen it every single morning. Jack was already dismounting. He checked the stable, first habit or instinct, the same way he checked doors, and came back to say the Calhouns had been through recently, wood restacked, horses, water trough cleared. Ruth's work probably. Emma could tell by the particular efficiency of it. She carried her saddlebag inside and stood in the middle of the cabin and breathed the smell of it. Wood smoke and pine, and the faint yeast smell that never quite left a space where bread had been made regularly, and then she went to the stove and started the fire. Jack came in behind her. You're going to cook before you rest, he said. I'm going to cook because it's what I do when I get home, she said. He said nothing to that. He hung up his coat and sat at the table, and she heard him pick up his book, which was where he'd left it 3 days ago, and she thought about how that was its own kind of extraordinary, that a person's life could be waiting for them exactly where they left it. She made cornbread and fried salt pork, and heated the last of the preserved beans from the cellar, and they ate without ceremony. 2 people at a table at the end of a long road, and the snow came down outside in the dark, and the fire held, and it was enough. Before she went to her room, she set the certified copy of Aldridge's ruling on the shelf above the fireplace between the tin of matches and the small framed photograph of her mother that she'd brought from Oak Hollow in her canvas bag. She looked at those 3 things together for a moment. Then she went to bed and slept without waking until 4. The letter from Mathers came 6 days later, and this one Emma read without bracing herself first. The territorial case against Silas Briggs had been formally opened. Aldridge had assigned a prosecutor from the Denver office. 3 of the 4 women whose guardianship documents had been filed as debt instruments had already been contacted by federal representatives, and 2 had agreed to give statements. The labor agreements Briggs used in his boarding house operation were under review. His lawyer, Holt, had filed 2 preliminary motions, and both had been denied. At the bottom of the letter in Mathers' businesslike hand, "Your testimony remains the anchor of this case." The judge's language from the September 14th ruling is being cited in the opening documents. You should know that. Emma read that last line twice. She went outside and found Jack splitting wood. He was always splitting wood in September, building the pile for the winter that was already suggesting itself in the cold of early morning, and she held out the letter. He read it, set the axe against the block. "Anchor of the case," he said. "Yes." He handed the letter back. His expression was doing that thing again, the one where it gave less than it felt. "Does that feel like enough?" he said. She thought about it honestly, the way she'd been trying to do all things. "For right now," she said. "Ask me again when the verdict comes." He nodded, picked up the axe. She went back inside and wrote to the 2 women who had agreed to give statements. She had their names from a second note Mathers had included separately, informal, outside the official correspondence. She wrote 2 letters. She told them what she knew. She told them about the timeline and the federal record and what Aldridge had said about the labor agreements. She told them at the end of each letter the same thing. The debt is not a verdict. The paper he made you sign is not who you are. She sealed both letters and put them on the table for the next supply run. Then she went back to the stove and tried the sourdough again. This was the 4th attempt. The altitude was the persistent problem. She had adjusted the hydration and the timing and the temperature twice, and was now working on a 3rd set of adjustments based on what she'd learned from the first 3 failures. It was, she had decided, essentially a negotiation between her knowledge and the mountain's conditions, and the mountain was not giving ground easily. The loaf went in. She sat at the table and waited. Jack came in from the woodpile an hour later and looked at her sitting there watching the stove. "The bread," he said. "Attempt 4. He sat across from her. He picked up his book. They waited. When she pulled the loaf out, it had risen correctly. The crust, the right color. The smell of it filling the cabin with something that made the space feel different, warmer, more settled, more like a place where people actually lived rather than sheltered. She set it on the rack. She looked at it. "Well," Jack said without looking up from his book. "Come look," she said. He came and looked. His eyes moved over the loaf the way they moved over most things, thorough, unhurried. "That's right," he said. "It's right," she agreed. She cut a slice, handed it to him. He ate it standing at the counter, and she watched his face, and his face was the face of a man eating bread that was exactly what bread should be. "Now you don't die here," he said. She stared at him. He looked at her, and for just a moment his expression opened completely, no tightening, no calculation. Just a man standing in his kitchen with a slice of bread, saying the truest thing he knew how to say. She recognized the words. She had thought them, or something like them, on the morning she built the fire before he came down from the loft on her first day. She had not said them because they weren't hers to say then. They were hers now. "No," she said, "I don't die here." Jump to play. October came down from the high peaks like a slow, deliberate decision, and the mountain became a different place. The light changed, the sounds changed. The cold moved from suggestion to fact. Emma learned the winter rhythms the same way she'd learned everything else, by paying close attention and making adjustments. She wrote to her father twice in October. The first letter was brief and factual. The case was progressing. Briggs's operation was under federal review. The bakery's supply lines should normalize if Briggs's attention was now on the territorial courthouse rather than on punishing Henry Whitaker for his daughter's escape. She did not ask her father how he was. She had decided she was not ready to ask that. The second letter was shorter. She wrote, I'm learning the mountain. It takes longer than you'd think. The bread is finally right. She didn't know why she told him about the bread. Maybe because it was the most honest thing she could say about where she was. Maybe because bread was the one language they had always shared, and she wasn't ready to give that up entirely even now. Oh. Her father wrote back once. He said Briggs's men had not been back to the bakery. He said the mill had extended credit again. He said Mrs. Hale still came in on Tuesdays and Thursdays and Saturdays, and always asked after Emma, and he told her Emma was doing well because he'd assumed she was, and he hoped he was right. He was right. She put his letter in the back of her journal and went back to work. The twist came on a Wednesday in late October, and it came from a direction Emma had not anticipated. Mathers rode up the trail, not a Calhoun rider this time. Mathers himself, which meant it was significant, and he arrived in the early afternoon with the leather document case under his arm, and an expression that Emma had learned to read as a man carrying a complicated thing. Jack was in the stable. Emma let Mathers in and put coffee on, and sat across from him and said, "Tell me." "Briggs is moving to settle," Mathers said. She stared at him. "A settlement. His lawyer filed yesterday. He's offering a complete withdrawal of all counterclaims, full acknowledgement that the guardianship documents were unlawfully applied, and a financial settlement to the affected parties." He opened the case. "Including you." Emma looked at the papers he set on the table. She did not pick them up. "What does he want in return?" she said. "The federal case drops. No criminal referral. No further proceedings against his lending operation. He gets to keep operating. Under modified terms with territorial oversight, which in practice means almost nothing," Emma said. "He adjusts his language and keeps doing what he does." She looked at Mathers directly. "That's what he wants." "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. Jack came in from the stable. He looked at Mathers and looked at Emma's face, and came to the table and read the settlement offer in silence. She watched him read it. His jaw tightened about 3/4 through. "No criminal referral," he said. "That's the core of it," Mathers said. "He wants immunity. He wants the case to end before it reaches the phase where Aldridge can recommend criminal charges to the federal prosecutor." Mathers paused. Which Aldridge was preparing to do, in about 3 weeks. Jack set the papers down. He and Emma looked at each other. "What do the other women want?" Emma said. Mathers looked at her. "Excuse me." The 2 women who gave statements. "And the third one, the one who hasn't agreed to speak yet. What do they want?" She kept her voice even. "This is their case too. Their names are in the record. Whatever we decide affects them. So what do they want?" Mathers opened his mouth, closed it. He looked like a man who had not expected this question first. "I haven't. The settlement was just filed yesterday. I came here first because your testimony is the anchor document, and Aldridge said your position matters most to how he responds." "Then I need to know what the others want before I tell you my position," Emma said. "Can you get word to them?" "That would take time." Briggs's lawyer set a response deadline of, "When?" Jack said. 10 days. Emma stood up. She walked to the fireplace. She looked at the certified ruling on the shelf, the one that said her name and said the marriage stands, and said legally null in reference to every document Briggs had tried to use against her. She thought about what Aldridge had said. "Your statement was the clearest documentation we have of how the operation works from the inside. It's going to matter." She thought about the women who were still inside that operation, still waking up every morning in a place they hadn't chosen with debt that didn't shrink. She turned around. "Tell Aldridge no," she said. Mathers looked at her. "We don't settle," she said. "Not like this. Not with him walking away from the criminal referral. The financial payment doesn't matter, mine or anyone else's. What matters is the precedent. What matters is whether the next woman he targets in the next territory has a federal criminal record to point to, or just a civil adjustment that his next lawyer can work around." She looked at Jack. "Am I wrong?" Jack held her gaze. "No." "Mrs. Hawthorne," Mathers said carefully, "a settlement is a guaranteed outcome. If the case proceeds and something goes wrong in the federal filing, does Aldridge think something will go wrong? Mathers paused. No. Does Aldridge want to settle? A longer pause. He sent me here to deliver the offer. He did not tell me to advocate for it. That's my answer, Emma said. Go back and tell him no settlement. Tell him we proceed. Tell him... She stopped, looked at the papers still on the table. Tell him the anchor holds. Mathers looked at her for a long moment. Then he picked up the papers and put them back in his case and drank the last of his coffee and stood. I'll ride back today, he said. Aldridge will have your answer by Friday. And the other women, Emma said. Get word to them. Tell them what the offer was and that we said no and why. They deserve to know. They deserve to make their own choice about whether they agree. I'll do that, Mathers said. He left. Emma stood in the middle of the cabin in the October quiet and felt the weight of what she'd just done. Not the legal weight, but the human weight of it. The three other women, wherever they were, waking up tomorrow without knowing yet that someone had turned down money on their behalf, because money wasn't the point. She hoped they would agree. She thought they would. Emma, Jack said. She turned. He was still at the table, and he was looking at her the way he had looked at her in the boarding house kitchen in the foothills that opened briefly unguarded. Look the one that let something show. You know what you're doing, he said. It wasn't a question. I know what I'm doing, she said. I know, he said. I just wanted to say it out loud, because it matters. He paused. You matter. What you just did matters. Emma looked at him across the table in the cabin that was hers by law and by labor and by choice, with the snow on the meadow outside and the fire in the grate and the sourdough bread cooling on the rack. She thought about the girl who had stood behind a bakery counter in the summer heat of Oak Hollow and watched a man she didn't know look at her bruised wrist and not say anything about it. She thought about $11.40 in a coffee tin. She thought about being 23 years old and already too tired to be surprised by anything. She thought about who she was now and the distance between those 2 points, and how that distance had been traveled not in a single moment, but in 100 small ones, building fires, adjusting bread, riding hard in the dark, giving testimony, writing letters, turning down money, standing in a judge's room and saying, "A grown woman is not property," without her voice shaking. "Thank you," she said, "for saying it." He nodded. She went back to the stove. That did. The federal case against Silas Briggs was formally advanced to criminal referral in November. Mathers sent word via the Calhoun Rider, a note just 3 lines because 3 lines were all it needed. Aldridge had submitted the criminal referral to the federal prosecutor in Denver. The 2 women who had given statements had both declined the settlement when contacted. The third woman, the one who had not yet spoken, had contacted Mathers' office the day after receiving word of Emma's refusal. She was ready to give her statement. Emma read the 3 lines at the kitchen table on a Tuesday morning with Jack sitting across from her, and she folded the note and set it down and sat quietly for a moment. "All 3, she said. "Yes," Jack said. "They all said no." They all said no. She breathed in, out. The fire in the stove made its small, even sound. "Good," she said. She went back to her bread. The criminal trial of Silas Briggs was not swift because federal trials never were, and Emma had not expected it to be. What she had expected was that the mountain would keep being the mountain through all of it, demanding seasonal indifference to the proceedings in Denver in the exact proportion that made those proceedings easier to endure. She was right. November deepened into a winter that was harder than anything she'd known in Oak Hollow. The snow came in earnest by mid-month, and the days shortened until the light was a brief visitor that arrived late and left early and apologized for nothing. The supply runs stopped. The Calhouns were 4 miles away and felt on the worst days like 40. The cabin shrank around her and Jack in the specific way of mountain winters, where the walls come closer, not because the structure changes, but because the world outside contracts to the size of what you can get through safely. She was not miserable. This surprised her somewhat. She had expected to find the confinement hard. She had never been a person who needed solitude exactly, and the bakery had given her the constant low-level company of customers and transactions, even when she was unhappy. But the winter on the mountain was a different kind of confinement. It had purpose in it. Every task was necessary. Every decision had consequence. There was no performance of work, because the work was entirely real. And there was Jack. Not there was Jack, the way there had been Henry Whitaker in the kitchen doorway, heavy and unpredictable, and looking for something to find fault with. There was Jack, the way there is a solid thing in a solid place, present, reliable, taking up appropriate space, and no more. He taught her things in the winter that he hadn't needed to teach her in summer. How to read the specific quality of cold that preceded a dangerous storm versus the kind that was merely uncomfortable. How to pack a wound which she hoped not to need but accepted as necessary knowledge. How to navigate the trail to the Calhoun place by landmarks rather than sight when the snow made the trail disappear. He taught her without condescension, which she had not always received from people teaching her things, and she received it without performance of gratitude, which she understood he would find uncomfortable. She taught him things too. He didn't know how to make bread. She had assumed this he'd lived alone 6 years on dried meat and beans, but she hadn't assumed how completely he didn't know, which was more completely than she'd imagined. She taught him the process from the beginning, the yeast, the hydration, the feel of dough that was right versus dough that was overworked. He was a careful student. He asked precise questions. He failed twice and did not appear to find this embarrassing, which she appreciated. The third time his loaf came out right. He looked at it. "Huh," he said, which was, she had come to understand the Jack Hawthorne equivalent of astonishment. "You can do it again now," she said. "I can do it when you can't," he said, meaning in case of injury, in case of illness, in case you need it done and can't do it yourself. That was how he thought, practically structurally, always, with the in case built in. She looked at him cutting a slice of his own bread and thought, there it is again. He says practical and means something else entirely. She didn't say that. It was the middle of December, and the time for saying some things was not yet right, and she was learning, among other things, to trust the timing of the mountain. The twist that changed everything came on Christmas Eve, which Emma had not been marking as Christmas Eve particularly. She had noted the date in her journal and thought about her mother, and moved on when Jack came in from the stable with a letter that had arrived somehow from somewhere through some combination of Calhoun riders and mountain persistence. It was from Aldridge, not Mathers. Aldridge himself in the judge's precise hand. Emma read it standing at the counter because she couldn't wait to sit down. Silas Briggs had not waited for the federal trial. He had entered a guilty plea. The details were dense and legal, and she read them 3 times to be sure she was understanding them correctly. The guilty plea covered the unlawful application of guardianship documents as debt instruments, fraudulent misrepresentation in labor agreements, and predatory lending practices with coercive elements in 3 territories. The settlement he'd offered in October, the one Emma had turned down, had been a last attempt to avoid exactly this. When it failed, when all 4 women refused when Aldridge submitted the criminal referral, and the federal prosecutor began building the case in earnest. Briggs's own lawyer had apparently told him what was coming, and Briggs had made the calculation that a negotiated guilty plea was better than a trial. His lending operation in Oak Hollow and 2 adjacent counties was ordered dissolved. His assets were being reviewed for restitution payments to affected parties. He was prohibited from operating in any lending property transfer or labor contracting capacity in any territory covered by the federal 6th Circuit, which was Aldridge's jurisdiction. 6 territories. At the bottom of the letter, Aldridge had written one sentence in a different ink, as though added after the formal letter was complete. The anchor held Mrs. Hawthorne. Well done. Emma stood at the counter holding the letter and felt something move through her that was too large and too complicated to name as a single thing. It was not simple happiness. It was more structural than that. It was the specific feeling of a foundation settling, of something that had been uncertain for months, finally becoming solid underfoot. She thought about 3 women she had never met who had woken up this morning inside a system that no longer legally existed. She thought about the one who had called Mather's office after hearing that Emma had refused the settlement. She thought about what it meant that 4 women strangers to each other had all said no to the money and yes to the fight, and that the fight had worked. She thought about her mother. She set the letter on the table and went to the door and opened it and stood in the cold of Christmas Eve on the mountain and looked up at the sky, which was clear and enormous and full of stars, in the way that the winter mountain sky was full of stars, more than seemed plausible, more than you could hold in your vision at once. She heard Jack behind her. "Emma?" "He pled guilty," she said. He came to the door. She handed him the letter, and he read it over her shoulder close enough that she could feel the warmth of him in the cold air. She heard the moment he got to the end, the slight change in his breathing. "6 territories," he said. "6 territories," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "My sister," he said. "This covers Larimer County." "Yes." He was very still. She didn't look at him because she understood that this was a moment he needed to have in the direction he was facing, not being watched. "Good," he said. His voice was even and quiet, and she could hear everything underneath it. They stood in the doorway for a while longer than they needed to in the cold of Christmas Eve, and the stars did what stars do, burned on indifferent necessary the best map there was. Then Jack said, "Come inside. It's cold." "I know it's cold," she said. "Emma." She turned and looked at him. He was holding the door, and the firelight from the cabin was behind him, and his face in that light was the face of a man who had been carrying something a very long time and had just set part of it down. "Come inside," he said again, quieter. She came inside. He let the door close behind her, and then because it was Christmas Eve, and the case was won, and the mountain was full of stars, he did something he had not done before. He reached out and put his hand on her face, just briefly, just his palm against her cheek, warm and steady, and saying everything he did not know how to say in the language of words. She put her hand over his and held it there for a moment. Then he let go and she let go, and they both understood that this too was a beginning, and beginnings deserved room to be themselves without being rushed. "I'll make supper," she said. "I'll get more wood," he said. She went to the stove. He went outside, and when he came back in with the wood and the cold air on his coat and the stars still going in the sky above the mountain, she was already making bread. Not because they needed bread, but because it was what she did, because it was hers, because the oven was warm, and her hands knew the work, and this cabin on this mountain, in this life, was the place she had chosen and claimed and built herself into, one morning at a time. The bread rose. The fire held. And Emma Hawthorne, who had been sold on paper and had made herself free, who had given her name as evidence, and one who had turned down money for principle and found other women willing to do the same, stood at her own stove on Christmas Eve, and was not owned by anyone on earth. That was not a small thing. That was everything.